Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Our first program of the 2023 Great Decision Series from the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. It's 8 weeks. We're here 7 more times right here, and we hope that you can be with us for as many as possible. These are topics suggested by the Foreign Policy Association in New York. They give us these topics every late summer, early fall, and then we diligently work on discussion leaders who can help us think about these issues and talk about them together. So we've got a great start to the series, and we hope you'll be with us for 7 more weeks to come. And certainly our hearts and prayers go out to the people of Turkey and Syria today. I don't know if you saw the news reports, but pretty extensive earthquake damage there. And both our speaker tonight and some of our guests have been in this region and know about it. And we just hope that there is people can get rescued if they need that. People can heal if they've been hurt, and pray for the grieving because there are many people grieving in those countries today. I'm Michael Van Dennen. I am the executive director of the council, and on behalf of my colleagues, Erica Kubik and Rachel Brooks, and the board of directors of the World Affairs Council, we are grateful that you're here, both so many of you in person, that's marvelous, and also online from all over the state and beyond. We are pleased to host a Great Decision series here at Grand Rapids Community College, and we're grateful to GRCC President Charles Lepper, to our faculty liaison Mike DeVivo, and to our video producer Class Quant, and all the folks here at GRCC for being great, great hosts. Council's mission is to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. We do that through the support of nearly 50 local businesses and 11 colleges and universities in our state. We try together to put on programs that are credible, objective, relevant, civil, and connecting. To change the world, we believe you first have to know the world. And you can learn more about what we do at worldmichigan.org. Before we begin, we want to thank Wolverine Worldwide for being our series sponsor, to WGVU Public Media, and to the Community Media Center for being terrific media sponsors, and to Grand Valley State University for being our topic sponsor for today. Tonight, we're so honored to have Ms. Deborah Amos here, NPR international correspondent. And thank you, Deb, for being here and to leading off this program. It's your third time as our guest. It's been a while, but we're so glad to have you again. After Ms. Amos's presentation, there will be ample time for questions. To those who are here, we will be passing a microphone, so you just raise your hand, we'll get you that microphone. For those watching online at our YouTube channel, you can text your question into the chat box, and we'll get it here. And if you're in person or online, you may also text your question to 616 308 6560. And you know our house rules here at the World Affairs Council. Ask your question respectfully and succinctly, because that will allow more people to ask questions if you do that. So now our council board member, Carrie Brosna, will introduce our speaker for this evening. Carrie?
Thank you, Michael. And thank you to everybody for participating today, both here and online. This is a wonderful showing of people for a great speaker that's coming up ahead of us. First of all, Wolverine is very pleased to once again sponsor the Great Decision Series. Wolverine and its brands have a large international footprint with employees, customers, consumers all over the globe. Like the council, Wolverine believes that we as West Michigan must engage the world thoughtfully. So let's get to a more interesting topic. Deborah Amos covers the Middle East for NPR News. Her reports can be heard on NPR's award-winning Morning Edition, All Things Considered, and Weekend Edition. In 2009, Amos won the Edward Weintel Prize for Diplomatic Reporting from Georgetown University, and in 2010 was awarded the Edward R. Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award by Washington State University. Amos was part of a team of reporters who won a 2004 Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Award for their coverage of the Iraq War. In 2003, Amos returned to NPR after a decade in television news, including ABC Nightline and World News Tonight, and the PBS programs Now with Bill Moyers and Frontline. When Amos first came to NPR in 1977, she worked first as a director and then a producer for Weekend All Things Considered until 1979. For the next 6 years, she worked on radio documentaries, which won her several significant awards. In 1982, Amos received the Prix Italia, the Ohio State Award, a DuPont Columbia Award for Father Care's Last of Jonestown, and in 1984, she received a Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award for refugees. From 1985 until 1993, Amos spent most of her time at NPR reporting overseas, to include the London bureau chief and as an NPR foreign correspondent located in Amman, Jordan. During that time, Amos won several other awards, including a DuPont Columbia Award and a Breakthrough Award, and widespread recognition for her coverage of the Gulf War in 1991. A member of the Council on Foreign Relations, Amos is the author of Eclipse of the Sunnis, Power, Exile, and Upheaval in the Middle East, and Lines in the Sand, Desert Storm and the Remaking of the Arab World. She also is a professor at Princeton University, where she teaches journalism during the fall term. Her presentation tonight is titled A Reckoning for War Crimes. Let's welcome Deborah Amos.
Hi, NPR listeners. It's so nice to see you in person. I know you thought I was taller. It is really great to be here and to be invited back to the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan and to kick off this great series. It's really astonishing that you all have this way to talk about international affairs, about what the world is doing. It's so easy to lose sight of what is happening out there. So I salute you just for this. As you heard from Michael, this is my third time. Big break for COVID. And I remember that the audiences in Grand Rapids ask great questions, so you are on notice. They make you work hard. So I just was in a student meeting where it was packed, and boy, did they ask great questions. So you have something to live up to. So we'll see what happens when I'm finished. I think it's appropriate to start a discussion on war crimes tribunals because it's really a discussion about accountability. So I applaud that decision because I believe that the way the international community addresses accountability in Ukraine will define the world that we live in. This is not just about Ukraine, but it's really about our future. Do we live in a rule-based world order or in a more brutish place where powerful international players can menace their neighbors? With no accountability, it is completely possible that that is the world that we will be living in. And at the very least, some accountability can help us pivot away from the world that we have been living in, which is a long, long era of impunity. I've been an atrocity correspondent for most of my career at National Public Radio. I travel from war zone to war zone, and I've watched over the years this steady elevation of human suffering. Because of those conflicts, the number of forcibly displaced people in our world is now reached 100 million. For the first time on record, the Ukrainian displacement put us over the top on those numbers. And this means 1 in every 78 people on Earth have been forced to flee, a dramatic milestone that few would have thought was possible just 10 years ago. I was covering the Syrian conflict, the uprising 10 years ago, and the ruthless tactics to shut it down at that time was eye-opening. The regime waged war on its citizens, and the Russian Air Force bombed its cities. Hospitals were hit, schools were targeted, so were bread lines, there were mass arrests, and thousands of people were thrown into prison and tortured. Men and women, even children. These were the hallmarks of that conflict. The Russian tactics are familiar in Ukraine. They'd done it all before in Syria, and they had gotten away with it. How did we get here? I believe we got here by ignoring justice for too long. Just a month before the Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, David Miliband, the head of the International Rescue Committee, decried the age of impunity. And here's what he said: "It's a time when militaries, militias, and mercenaries in conflicts around the world believe they can get away with anything. And because they can get away with anything, they do everything: chemical weapons, cluster bombs, landmines, bombing of school buses, besiegement of cities, blocking of humanitarian supplies, targeting journalists, targeting humanitarian aid workers. You name it, we have seen it. And we're sensing more of it and seeing less outrage about it and less accountability for it." And that was a month before the Russians invaded Ukraine. In the early days of the invasion, the tactics of this aggressive war were so outrageous, it was difficult to process the news reports that were coming in from the battlefield. Was it possible that thousands of Ukrainian children are being forcibly deported to Russia? Could the brutal stories of rape be actually true? Did the Russians really bomb a building that had children in very large letters on the roof? Were civilians in Mariupol starved? Were the power station bombed in Ukraine to weaponize the winter? The answer, sadly, to all of those questions is yes. But as the BBC's Quentin Somerville said in one of his dispatches from the front lines in Ukraine, if these tactics are unfamiliar to you, then you haven't been paying attention. Like me, Somerville covered Syria for years before he headed to Ukraine, so much of it was sadly familiar. And as I watched the coverage of the Bucha massacres, I was reminded of those in Hula in the early days of the Syrian uprising. It was the murder of civilians by Syrian government forces. It was shocking in 2012 when the first images appeared on TV. Shocking when we, as the Reporter Corps, got to go to the village of Hula and see what had happened. Again, it was women, men, and particularly children. That back then, the UN met in emergency session. The violence was condemned. There was a sense that Hula was a turning point for accountability. But of course, it wasn't. The Russians arrived a few years later. The Syrian conflict would continue for another decade with escalating violence and no accountability. Not for President Assad, who declared war on civilians, but in particular not for the Russian generals who were sent to save the regime from the rage of its people. And it worked. The rebellion was quashed, but the country was destroyed. The same Russian generals that Syrians called the Butcher, the man who mounted a brutal attack on the civilians of the Syrian city of Aleppo, was again massacring Ukrainian civilians in Mariupol. How did we get here? I believe we got here by ignoring justice for too long and being lulled into complacency by history. Let's roll back this story, we often do this in podcasts, to November 9th, 1989. I arrived in Berlin close to midnight after a frantic dash to get there. This was historic. The Berlin Wall was coming down. The streets were already packed with giddy East Germans who'd been surging west for hours. They had pockets full of welcome money. It was a fulfilled promise by the West German government that they would get 200 Deutschmarks if they arrived in West Berlin. And that's exactly what they did. They headed first to the banks and then to the grocery stores. They shopped for bananas. That was a rare luxury in the East. They could see it on television if they weren't, as it was called in that day, West blind, meaning they couldn't see German television, but many of them could. And they could see that in West Germany, you could buy bananas, and you could not do the same in the East. And so I saw many people carrying these yellow bunches on the streets of Berlin, and it was an indelible memory of that moment in 1989. I understood that the Iron Curtain was a physical barrier, but it was also the symbol of this ideology that was now crumbling too, and I watched the concrete shatter along with the division between the two Berlins. The Cold War was officially over. It was an era that defined my childhood. And I'm sure that many of you in this audience feel the same. History would move faster now. Western leaders promised a new era of democracy, free trade, and the free movement of people and ideas. More than 30 years later, I was in Berlin again. There, because I was covering the first war crimes trial for Syrians in a German court. A guilty verdict, crimes against humanity, a life sentence. A few weeks after that, on February 24th, 2022, Vladimir Putin declared war on Ukraine with tanks, troops, and took direct aim at this 30-year global system of order. Within days, the Ukrainian refugees started to arrive at Berlin Central Station. These were middle-class families that brought their pets with them. They looked dazed and disoriented, a trickle, and then a flood. I saw them every day in the train station. I could hear Ukrainian spoken on the streets all the time. It felt like history's clock was unwinding, this time with an unpredictable speed and an outcome that will take decades to play out. This is why the calls for accountability now are so important. Ukraine is what happens when there isn't any. Russia's expansion didn't start with Ukraine. There was Chechnya, there was Georgia, there was the Donbass in Ukraine, and there was Crimea. Then the Syrian intervention in 2015. This was Putin's first military action outside the former Soviet Union, and it gave him a revived role in the Middle East. He was coming to save a long-time ally. The Assads and Russia had been in it together for decades. In fact, the older Assad had gotten his military training in a Moscow military school. The close ties between Moscow go back through families. And for Putin, it was a new platform. Libya was now within reach for him. The Russians parlayed the intervention into growing Russian influence in the Gulf and in Israel. Washington figured that Putin was part of the solution in Syria, not the problem, and didn't say much about the brutality. But Russian brutality is also a feature in Ukraine, and so is the looting. That's what Joel Rayburn told me. He served as the U.S. Special Envoy to Syria under President Trump. And he added these details. The Russian generals, over time, came to view Syria as a sort of pension augmentation exercise. He told me officers would compete for a Syrian assignment as a way to demand payments. It was more like a shakedown, he said. Real estate, oil fields, potash contracts, part of the drug trade, cash, the lucrative Captagon market, nothing was off limits. Rayburn is convinced that many of Russia's top officers believed there would be the same opportunities in Ukraine when they were reassigned. What if they'd been forced to pay a price, an accountability price for what they did in Syria, or Chechnya, or Georgia, or the Donbass? What if there had been accountability back then? Would it have changed Putin's calculations? Rayburn is convinced the answer to that is yes. But perhaps Ukraine also offers the international community another chance to maybe get it right this time. Perhaps there have been lessons learned over this past decade. It seems that this time the international system of governance is taking seriously the idea of accountability backed by resources, specialists, and renewed resolve. Just a few weeks into the invasion, a White House reporter got President Biden to say out loud that he considered Russian President Vladimir Putin a war criminal. Biden's words reverberated around the world as the leader of one nuclear power called out the leader of another in words that have weight in international law. What it seemed is it was an early signal that a consensus had shifted. Washington was talking about war crimes trials in European capitals. There were calls for tribunals. As Russian troops withdrew from Ukrainian towns and images of atrocities shocked the world. The evidence seemed unquestionable despite Russian denials. Ukraine's domestic prosecutor filed the first criminal charges on April 28, 2022, against Russian soldiers allegedly involved in mass killings in Bucha. The first verdicts were handed down shortly after. In this story, there are a few bright spots. They are hard to find, but there's been this overwhelming outpouring of support for Ukraine in Western capitals. And here are some examples. 141 countries voted in the UN General Assembly to condemn Russian aggression. The UN created a commission to document crimes, and the EU has just done a similar thing in the past week. 48 countries have referred the Ukraine conflict to the International Criminal Court. That's the biggest grouping of states that have ever done so. Washington and European countries have sent weapons and ammunition. Elon Musk sent the internet. Western companies have pulled their businesses out of Russia, and a network of governments have imposed tough financial sanctions. But still, the war goes on. So the next steps, the steps that will define accountability in an international courtroom, are important. Some of that work is now underway. There are many moving parts. There are many players. There are investigators, trainers, open source sleuths, geolocators, police trainers, international judges, and academics working on a new system for accountability in and out of Ukraine and in European capitals, and lobbying in Washington to Congress. Many are calling for the Nuremberg model that's based on the first International War Crimes Tribunal, mindful of the purpose of justice, according to Robert Jackson, who was the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg. He stressed that the ultimate step in avoiding periodic war is to make statesmen responsible to law. He insisted on the need for power to be accountable to reason. The laws developed for Nuremberg are still on the books. There's a crime against humanity, and it was developed by Hirsch Lauterpacht. He was a legal scholar from Lviv. Back then, it was still part of Poland. And then there's genocide and the Genocide Convention that was developed by Raphael Lemkin, also a legal scholar, also from Lviv, ironically. But arguably, the most important crime developed for the Nuremberg trials came from a brilliant Soviet jurist, and his name was Aaron Trainin. And he developed this definition. He called it a crime against peace. It's also known as a crime against aggression. But what it is for planning, preparation, initiation, waging, or participation in a common plan or conspiracy related to a war of aggression. It was the centerpiece of the Nuremberg trials because everything came from there. If you could convict the Nazi leadership of a crime of aggression, then all of it was already almost proven. So that's why it's called the leadership crime. And it was the central crime of Nuremberg. It's part of the reason that it's called the leadership crime, and I'm going to quote from Jackson again, it's because you want the intention of the prosecution not to incriminate all of the German people, but to reach the planners, the designers, the insiders, and the leaders, without whose evil architecture the world would not have been for so long scourged with the violence and lawlessness of this terrible war. It's hard not to think about Ukraine when you hear that definition. This is the crime that Ukrainian leaders insist must be prosecuted, the crime of aggression. But here's the problem. There are huge challenges ahead, which we're going to come to in a moment. One court that could play a potential role is the International Criminal Court at The Hague, established 2 decades ago. The ICC is a permanent international court designed to investigate and prosecute individuals for the most serious international crimes, including the crime of aggression. It's been a disappointment over the past 20 years, but Ukraine may redeem the court's reputation. The ICC does have the power to prosecute heads of state and top members of government, even if they're in office. In every other country, primarily national courts, these leaders have immunity and are shielded from prosecution as long as they are in office. But that is not true for the ICC. There's one contradiction. The ICC's jurisdiction only extends to member states and states that have agreed to its jurisdiction, such as Ukraine, but not Russia. Russia, like the US, never joined the court. So the crime of aggression, that prosecution at the ICC, is out. The other avenue could be an international war crimes tribunal called by the United Nations Security Council. But we know that there would be certain members on that council, Russia and China come to mind, that would likely veto such a plan. So now the role of the United Nations General Assembly becomes particularly relevant. This body could vote to establish an international war crimes tribunal, and the two elements that are important would be part of its mandate. This tribunal, because it's international, would have the jurisdiction for the crime of aggression and could prosecute head of state. No immunity in an international court. So both of these matters could be taken care of in an international one-off tribunal voted by the UN General Assembly. But it's far from clear that the majority of countries in the General Assembly would vote for such a tribunal. Here's one indication of how the vote might go. Among the G20 countries, which account for some 85% of the global economic output, only about half of those members have joined the sanctions imposed on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. It appears that much of the world isn't ready to follow the US and European efforts to isolate President Vladimir's Russia. How likely is it that they would sign on for a war crimes tribunal? Really far from clear. And there's another issue that will have to be addressed if there is to be an international war crimes tribunal, and that addresses the crime of aggression. An international court can issue arrest warrants, but a trial cannot be held in absentia. The alleged perpetrator has to show up. In Nuremberg, the Nazi leadership had already been defeated, the leaders arrested, it was the end of the war. What are the chances that Putin would show up in The Hague? Or his defense minister, or even his foreign minister for that matter? Most opinion writers say it's highly improbable. But human rights lawyers will argue that it's not beyond the realm of possibilities. And they point to the example, of course, of Slobodan Milosevic. His murderous campaign to create a greater Serbia is often compared to Putin's ambitions in Ukraine. Milosevic was the first head of state to be put on trial in an international court facing charges of genocide. Yes, it happened. It happened late, but it did happen. Eventually, two of his most senior henchmen were also prosecuted in The Hague. But because it happened once, there's no guarantee it will happen again. But what it does show is justice takes time. You have to wait, perhaps for a change of government, for underlings to defect. You have to wait for leaders to grow old, to lose power, to fall out of favor, or, as in Serbia, it may take dangling sanctions relief in exchange for handing over an alleged war criminal, kind of like bail in reverse. In conclusion, it's worth noting that there have been some unprecedented moves in the United States that gives support for accountability and some hope for where we're going. The Ukraine policy in Washington is not just about handing over weapons and escalation of lethality. It's also a quieter change linked to Ukraine. It's about the law. And one of the most recent changes in U.S. law is a provision that allows the U.S. to cooperate with the International Criminal Court in regards to Ukraine. After years of strident opposition to the ICC due to concerns that the U.S. military or U.S. citizens could be tried in The Hague, the Pentagon, the CIA, two Republican administrations were adamant to keep the U.S. from joining the court, and of course we did. Surprisingly, this recent reversal was led by a Republican, Senator Lindsey Graham, and it passed the Senate by a unanimous vote. It's a narrow bill. It's only about Ukraine, and part of the selling point, there are no U.S. military members on the ground in Ukraine. It's also a recognition that the ICC is the only court that actually could prosecute a head of state, despite the prohibitions on the crime of aggression. War crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, they're all part of the court's jurisdiction. In fact, this new law provides for the closest cooperation with the ICC in its 20-year history. ICC investigators can now come to Washington to investigate. They can work with U.S. intelligence agencies to scour sophisticated satellite imagery for evidence of war crimes. They can track Russians who have come to the United States. And they can also work with the State Department's Conflict Observatory. This is a newly developed operation since the Russian invasion. The idea here is to capture and analyze evidence of alleged war crimes in Ukraine. The observatory has put out a number of reports through a partnership with open source investigators, which includes Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab and the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. Here's some of the things that they've looked at. A damaged building assessment in Bakhmut. Hershan's Regional Art Museum reported looting event. Kyiv falling into darkness. These research partners are known as open source investigators, and they use satellite imagery, they use social media, they use government reports, Facebook, and they look through all of these things to find evidence of war crimes in real time. And that is actually quite new for investigators. And it's the future of the research of researching war crimes. They can document it in real time. At the same time, there are new protocols that have been developed so that this evidence can actually go straight to court. And because of the Lindsey Graham law, this information can go straight to the ICC. And because of the protocols written over the last few years, chain of custody, the same kind of thing that is always true of evidence, it can be used in court. Another new law is also connected to Ukraine, and that is the law that allows, for the first time, American courts to prosecute war criminals who are discovered in the United States who are not U.S. citizens. For years, the only remedy was to jail them and deport them. And it's called the Justice for Victims of War Crimes Act. It was no accident that it passed just a few days after Ukraine's president addressed the U.S. Congress. The new law fixes this glaring loophole, and it was Senator Dick Durbin who took his moment. He's been trying for 20 years, and it took the war in Ukraine to get this thing passed. He doesn't yet have legislation in America for a crime against humanity, but he promises that it will happen and it won't take another war to do it. And so now the U.S. has jurisdiction over anyone who commits a war crime and is present in the United States. It's like universal jurisdiction that they have in Europe. It doesn't sound like much, but it's actually a big change because war criminals come here. They own property here, they get jobs here, they come live with their kids here, and they try to disappear in America, which is not that hard. And this changes the stakes for them because this says, if we find you, we can prosecute you. For those of you who remember the Berlin Wall coming down and the embrace of what we called back then the peace dividend, the feeling that this was the end of a historic chapter, well, somehow that wasn't the end. It was just a chapter, and eventually it led us to this historic moment. The Russian invasion of Ukraine seems to be as monumental as the day the wall came down. It raises questions about policies that got us here, our attitudes about accountability, and the kind of world we want to live in. The conclusion of this war will define the world order one way or the other. Accountability can establish new rules, but it must go beyond Ukraine. It's a test of the rule of law for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deb. We appreciate it. You got us thinking many, many thoughts, and I appreciate that much. Time for you to ask questions. You can raise your hand if you're here in the auditorium. If you're not, type your questions into the YouTube chat box, and we'll get your query in the mix, or you can text 616-308-6560. And Deb, I'll just start off. You mentioned that so many things are different about recording war crimes now, even Russian soldiers on Facebook. Tell us a little bit more about these things that are happening now that weren't available 10, 15 years ago.
Well, it was 10. Syria was where it first starts. So Bellingcat gets a start in Syria. The Yale group that I mentioned, they get their start in Sudan. They're doing the same kind of work in Sudan. But there's a couple of things that are really interesting. One is that all of us can, if we want, I doubt anybody in this room does this, but you can, have facial recognition software on your phone. It's, commercially available. But the Bellingcat people tell me that it's been trained on Russian AI. Russians love an app called Find My Clone. And so there's huge amount of data on Russian faces. And for reasons I don't understand, the Russian military also likes to put their pictures on Facebook or VK, which is the Russian version of Facebook. And so it's not hard to be able to identify a Russian who was in your village doing God knows what. And, there's one thing I have to say about for all of you who are cynical about, if you tell somebody nothing ever happens, the Ukrainians all put their phones up. And there is 10 years of video now in Ukraine after 1 year of war. And all of it is data, all of it. So who was that guy? Who was the member of the 64th Mechanized uh, Brigade, whatever they call it? I never know the military words. Who came to Bucha? Well, people took pictures of them, so they're starting to be identified. And the Ukrainian government puts those pictures on websites. And there have been some countries in Europe and Canada who are sanctioning those people before there's any trials because you can. And sanctioning them essentially means they don't travel very far anymore. So that is happening. There is unbelievably accurate satellite imagery that is publicly available. Maxar is the one that NPR uses, and Yale, because they're working with the US government, also has access to even more sophisticated satellite imagery. And the other thing they have is something called the Wayback Machine. So you can say, I want to see this now, and I want to see this a year ago. One of the projects Yale did was they mapped all of Ukraine's grain silos. And they had the help of Livermore Laboratory to do that because that's a big job. What you have to do is you have to create an AI that recognizes a shape, and that takes a while to get it right, so that you're only getting grain silos and not chimneys. But you can do it. It's possible to do. And so when you map all of them, you can see, okay, which ones can I see which ones are hit, and the imagery is fine enough that you actually can see it, and you can look at it on what was it like before the war and make that comparison. And they issued a report that said 17% of the grain silos in Ukraine were deliberately hit because there was nothing around them, flat ground for as far as the eye could see. So there's those things. Then there's Telegram. This is a messaging service that is favored. I'm on Telegram. If you are a reporter and you do any of this work in the Middle East, Syrians like Telegram, so do the Russians. And these are message services that you can read. Some of it's encrypted. If you're clever, you can talk your way into these chat rooms, and people do. The morality of that is a tiny bit questionable, but there's plenty of it that is just out there. And so the Pentagon is certainly reading Telegram because there's a lot of these mill bloggers, they're called, from Russia, who are just speaking openly about what they think is going on the ground. And it's very interesting for anybody who wants to, get that fine grain sense of the war. It's astonishing what you can know now with all of these tools. However, the people who do this work also will tell you it's astonishing to realize how much we still don't know. They still do not have precise figures about many things, but you can make a case that this happened, that there are mass graves here, that there are grain silos that are targeted, that a museum was looted, that the top of a building that says children was hit by the Russians. Those things you can do.
Got a couple of text questions, and we can take some audience questions as well. First is nuclear deterrence, and do we think that could circumvent the prosecution of war crimes?
That would be the end of the world.
Well, right. So the sense of, well, if I am prosecuted or Russia is prosecuted, I'm going to retaliate with nuclear weapons. Would we, first of all, buy that? Would we take it seriously?
There's been a while that we have. Germany much more than here because they had Chernobyl for real, and Chernobyl's cloud went west. And I was in plenty of meetings in Berlin where the Germans would say, "God, you remember when we couldn't, buy any milk? We couldn't drink it because we didn't know what was in it. Was it, radioactive?" There was crazy things that happened. For a while, the Russians just let all their children drink that milk and then realized that was a bad idea and had to, throw away tons of it. So it's more palpable in Europe than it has been here. But at the same time, you know, for a while, the Russians were in Chernobyl, they were in Zaporizhia, they were in the nuclear facilities in Ukraine, and that was a little unsettling. And then, I read just a couple of weeks ago, and I have to think that this must be what happened. That, you know, Putin's allies, and I can't imagine that Biden was not part of this discussion somehow, but Putin's allies pretty much said, dude, you use nuclear and we're done. We are all done with you. They did it publicly, both China and India, a while back. It was, chiding, like, what's up with this war, Mr. Putin? But I think that back channel, that he has been told that it's off the table. And if you've noticed, a little bit on television, on Russian television, the hardest lines of them will say, let's just nuke London. But for the most part, I have not seen Putin refer to anything nuclear in quite some time.
Can you expand more on the bill Lindsey Graham passed to do with the ICC? I think I was so shocked to hear that I wasn't listening thoroughly, but so we haven't fully joined it, but we're recognizing just this investigation,
Correct.
like some weird observer status.
No, it's much more fulsome than Observer. And it's funny that you said that, because I interviewed David Sheffer, who negotiated that under the Clinton administration. He was the ambassador for war crimes issues, and then under Madeleine Albright, there was a negotiation. We signed it but didn't join it, because then the next administration, the Bush administration, hated it. So they said no, thank you. And so you're right. So for years, no court, no, we don't do that. And Sheffer said to me, if you told me in January that we were going to do this, I would have said, where's that coming from? But it's Ukraine. I could argue, if I was really cynical, that if you say that you're going to cooperate with the ICC, then you don't have to think about that pesky international tribunal that has the crime of aggression, which you really don't like. So I don't know. Maybe that's part of it. Let's see how it plays out. That could be why. But there's no American soldiers on the ground, so there's no that fear from the Pentagon that they'll all be designated war criminals, and then no one can go to the NATO headquarters because you'll get arrested in Brussels. So it means a lot that they can come here for the first time ever and talk to the intelligence agencies here and see the satellite stuff. And because by the time they get here, they'll know which crimes they're looking at, and they'll know what they need to make a case. So it's kind of a big deal. Now, that assumes there is a case. That assumes there is a prosecution. That assumes somebody shows up. But, it's not going to start with Putin. It's really not. There is a guy who was part of the 64th Mechanized who was in Bucha, who, I don't know how he did this, but he got himself to Spain. And he asked for asylum, and he said, I want to testify. So there's little things that happen that make you think, well, maybe there'll be lower level trials first, and we'll see what happens next.
We have another text question. Did you ever foresee President Zelensky becoming the inspirational leader for Ukraine that he has?
Why would I be any different than anybody else? No. I wasn't paying attention. I don't know about you, but I wasn't. I knew he was a comedian. I knew his program, Servants of the People. He played a history teacher, because this is a war about history. And whose history that we're going to tell? Is it going to be the Russian version of history or the Ukrainian version of history? How are we going to sort that out? Because both men are using history. Putin in 2021 wrote a huge paper. That's what he did on his COVID vacation. And it was all about, sorry, folks, but Ukraine is Russia and Russia is Ukraine. And so we're going to have to do this. and Zelensky was able to put his view of history in his TV program. He's been remarkable. He's been just remarkable. But here is what's crazy. So all of his comedy writers, of course, are now writing his speeches like to Congress. That's who's writing them. But all it means is that they have impeccable timing. Impeccable timing. And if you want to entertain yourself, please go look up his role in Dancing with the Stars. And my personal favorite is Gay Cossacks, which I don't know when he did that one, but he dances with four guys in latex, and it is very, very funny.
Boy, how do you follow up that comment? Please raise your hand for a question. Oh, there's one over here. I wonder too about what about the other war crimes going on? There are many,
Oh, there's plenty.
and Africa always gets overlooked. So you got Boko Haram.
Oh, no, no, no. Africa didn't get overlooked. In fact, the
No.
only cases that the ICC has ever taken is from Africa.
Oh, it's great.
Yeah. Like it only happens there.
So I kind of had it's kind of like a social media question because I was seeing all about the prisoner swap with Brittany Griner and the Russian arms dealer or whoever, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts and kind of expand on that.
So, reporters don't have opinions, right? So, I'm just going to say who's against a prisoner exchange? Honestly, what did she do? She had a vape pen in her bag. Um, who hasn't done that? So, you know, so I don't know what to say to you, to tell you the truth, because there's no way to step into that one without taking on opinion, which I'm not prepared to do. Thank you for letting me off easy.
Okay, we've got a couple more text questions. Here's a quick one. Why not just have Putin assassinated?
Oh, good. That's a world I want to live in. Who wouldn't have said that about our last president? Come on, that's not what we do. I'm sorry, we just don't. So, no, that is a bad idea. I like the rule of law myself. I don't think it always works. That's the problem with justice. It's slow, and it doesn't always win. But you got to do it anyway. So, I think that system is better than any other one that there is. Thank you very much. And we're kind of back to Nuremberg if we can figure this out.
So, as you talk about accountability, I was noticing stories popping up last week about the potential that Ukraine had deployed landmines
I know.
on their own territory. Is that going to bring up tricky questions of going after someone like President Zelensky as well as President Putin at the same time? And is that something you could see a reckoning with?
So it's unbalanced, and that's a bit of a problem with these kind of things. Yes, I saw that story too. Yes, there was a human rights report that said that Ukrainians were putting weapons in neighborhoods, and that's against international law, and that's true. Their argument was, but that's where the Russians were shelling, so of course we had to be there. Um, I think it's probably true that Ukraine has gotten a bit of a pass on things that reporters know that has happened, and hasn't gotten big coverage because the imbalance is so great. The Ukrainians are not weaponizing winter. They're not kidnapping children. Are they using, and landmines? A funny thing about landmines, which I didn't know until recently, is they're legal in some uses. They are legal against troops. You just can't use them against civilians. So, okay, you might argue that they put them there when there were Russian troops and now they're civilians and they're getting killed by them, and that's a bad thing. Yes, it is. Is it a war crime? I don't know. War crimes are tricky things. So, if you starve a population, you have to prove intent. Is that what you intended to do, or is that what happened when you couldn't get the food to where there's these are hard questions. So you're not wrong about that. People talk about it, but I think we have to, and I think that there will be some charges of that. But we're still in the middle of a horrible, brutal, terrible war. So I do understand when the Ukrainians say, "Come on, look at the difference between what they do and what we do." And for a while, I think there'll be a pass. It can't be forever. There has to be an accounting for all of it. And I hope that we have one. But there's no guarantee that we will.
I know there's some other questions, but I'll slip in a text question. Do we trust, and by we, does the U.S. military trust our ability to assess the military of other countries after overestimating the Russian military? How is that?
After
After
overestimating. So, it's a good question. And, I am no military person. So, I don't know. I do know that the Ukrainian military trained with National Guard, American National Guard for years. I do know that, and the Americans know that the Ukrainian military, unlike many other parts of the government, cleaned up their act in terms of corruption. That's been written about, and there are trainers in Poland for Ukraine. They're now going to bring some Ukrainians to the United States. We never did that with the Russians. But I mean, it's a very important question about the overestimation of the Russian military. And boy, sometimes I think what a deal it is to arm the Ukrainians. I mean, we have degraded the Russian military, the greatest threat for the U.S. military, by what, 50%? And we did it on the cheap. It hasn't cost a single American life. It will not be able to rebuild for years. That's a pretty good deal. Because I think I saw a breakdown of the cost. It's like $350 for every American. Yeah, it's a lot of money. There's no doubt it's a lot of money, but it's not that much money considering what it would take to do that on our own.
What do you think about the possibility that the generals could rise up in Russia because they cannot be satisfied with the war the way it's going?
It's possible. I don't know. I don't know enough about Russia to be able to really say much about if it's possible. It gets a little complicated because it's not just the Russian military. Now you have the Wagner Group,
Mm-hmm.
and you have Putin's chef, who's the head of the Wagner Group, and he is very clearly competing directly with the Russian military. Because he has taken territory at a time where the Russian military has taken none. And they have just been beaten back and beaten back by the Ukrainian forces. Now, he is incredibly brutal. He went to Soviet prisons and recruited there and doesn't care whether they live or die, and they know that too. But God, it's not much better in the Russian military. The losses are astonishing. But I always think about what Joel Rose told me about these same men who went to Syria and went there because they wanted a potash contract. Are they interested in overthrowing Putin? Depends on, does it bother their interests? So I don't know. Could the oligarchs? I don't know. And you bring somebody to me who will tell one way or the other, and I would be happy about it. But I don't think anybody knows. That's the problem.
Can war crimes, crimes of aggression, genocide, can those be waived as part of a bilateral settlement between Ukraine and Russia, or the right to participate in any judicial proceedings?
Yeah, they could. I mean, I think about that a lot because here's what's an interesting thing to watch. National Day in Ukraine is sometime in August. And I was watching in August as we were leading up to that, and two things were interesting. One is Putin kept saying that he was going to have a war crimes trial in Mariupol. And in fact, they installed cages in the theater, and cages doesn't mean anything. It's just the Egyptians do this too. That's where you put the defendant. They don't sit in a table in the front. They sit in a cage. That's just how it's done. And they were rubbing their hands. That by that time they had the steel guys, and before they took all those steel guys to prison, the Russians and they now do this all the time. They make them all take their clothes off. So what they're looking for are tattoos, and they're looking for Nazi symbols. And what a ton of them had was Banderas, his whole face on their backs. I saw them. They put it up on Twitter right away. And this guy, Banderas, was the Nazi collaborator guy in Ukraine. So if you got that on your back, you probably are a neo-Nazi. And it's probably true that some of those guys in that steel plant had been when they were younger. I think they were rooted out over the last 10 years. That particular brigade was kind of known, and I think they got most of them out, but the Russians were clever to look for those guys. And I thought, they're going to do it. They're going to do this trial, and they're going to show off those tattoos, and they're going to see it as a propaganda coup. Then the next thing I see is a prosecutor from London, Jeffrey Nice, a Monty Python name if there ever was one. But he was the prosecutor of Milosevic. And as Putin's talking about this trial in Mariupol, Zelensky has Jeffrey Nice come to his office, and the two of them talk about, so, you think it would be easy to have an international tribunal like you did for Milosevic? And he goes, yeah, it'd be easy. And I thought, I don't think so. And you think you could do the crime of aggression? Yeah, I think we could. And I thought, he's trolling Putin. Why else would you bring Jeffrey Nice in the middle of this? That's what I think. Do I know it's true? I do not. However, the next thing that happens is there's no trial on the anniversary of Ukraine Day, and there's a prisoner exchange. Now, what happens when there's a prisoner exchange is both sides are giving up people that could go to court, that could, fix that, you can't have a trial in absentia. But both sides went, okay, and they've been having them on a regular basis. So that kind of addresses your question. Is that what they keep doing? Is it easier? Is it more popular? Certainly for Zelensky, is it more popular to bring those guys back alive than to have a war crimes trial? Yeah, I think it is at this point in this war. And that appears to be his priority every time, because those prisoner exchanges, and they gave the big oligarch guy back that they had captured, who was Putin's pal. They traded him back. And I didn't think they would do that, because that's their card. That's the court thing. But they didn't, and so it's hard to. I have no inside. I just watch, but it's hard to fault anybody who wants a quicker solution than a war crimes trial, because you can wait forever. I mean, Nuremberg was astonishing that it happened as quickly after the war as it did. It's kind of like capturing Milosevic. There's no that's lightning. It strikes, and you can't be sure it will strike again. So I suppose it's fair to think, okay, it's better to get our guys back than it is to hang on to somebody for a war crimes trial that we don't know will ever happen, because everybody's investigating the crap out of this war, but nobody's telling us that we can go to trial.
Excuse me. I was wondering if if anybody's doing any planning on the subject of rebuilding Ukraine after the devastation, because it seems to me that history has shown, as an example with Germany in World War I and World War II, that something like the Marshall Plan was a good idea, and therefore, and other times like in Syria and Sarajevo, it seems like nothing's done, and the place just disintegrates.
Well, because in Syria the war's not over.
Oh well,
There's that.
Sorry, yeah, there's that. Okay, I just wondered if if there's any planning being
Yeah,
done. I mean, by NATO or by United States or by European Union or by anybody else.
I can't tell you anything specifically, but people are talking about how much it's going to cost to fix it. I think the more interesting uh, planning is around, a green peace, and there are lots of people in Ukraine who are talking about that. How do we? I had a student who wrote a paper on ecocide and how damaged the ground is. And I said, you could write a headline for your story that says Africa will be eating the Ukraine war for 2 generations, because that is what's happening. And some of that wheat won't be able to be shipped because the soil is that toxic. So what do you do? That is huge. You can even Syria rebuilds buildings, but how do you make dirt come back to life? That is a much harder thing. And in some cases, you just have to leave it fallow. But people are starting to talk about that, because Ukraine's identity, its wealth, is in the ground. That's why the blue and the yellow in their flag. That's what the sunflower is about. It's a flower that doesn't bend, but it is a remarkable piece of foliage. So that I know is happening already, and I think that Europe will, of course, support rebuilding. I'm sure that they will when the war is over. And when will that be? That's the problem.
What war crimes tribunal is going on right now where that you are most hopeful bring someone to justice in the near future? Is there one on the horizon?
Yes, there's one in Frankfurt, and it's the Syrian ones because they're the most developed right now. There's a doctor who worked in a military hospital and tortured prisoners to death, and he is on trial in Frankfurt. And it was one of those things that also happens here. It's why we changed the law, where he came on a visa that Germany gives out to doctors because they need them, and Syria actually has an excellent medical school. So he came. They bring him in on language visas, and he had a practice. And somebody said, "Wait a minute, what is that guy doing here?" And so he's now on trial. And I think that they have the evidence. We'll see. And there's another one that's going on in Berlin, and that one is a guy who shot off a mortar into the Yarmouk refugee camp and killed a bunch of people who were waiting in line for food.
Are those German national courts or international courts?
National.
National.
Because Germany has universal jurisdiction, so you don't have to be a German citizen, and the crime does not have to be committed on your soil. But if you have the witnesses, and of course, when you have 1 million Syrians, you do, and they have witnesses for both of those cases, people who were actually in those hospitals, or in the case of the guy who shot the mortar into Yarmouk, people who were there that day. So they have both. That's why they can do these trials.
Thank you.
You started off talking about this age of impunity, and we think of the war crimes and those convictions, and I think of those like U.S. Criminal convictions. They're usually about retribution, and it doesn't necessarily change behavior. It's exacting revenge, and so I'm wondering, as you think about that, are there examples of how the prosecutions by the ICC could lead to changing behavior? Do you have any thoughts on could that actually accomplish it, or is it just another way of exacting revenge over something that's horrific that's happening?
A little of both, I think. I mean, let's think about Nuremberg. Did that, change behaviors? That was, Victor's justice. It was. I think that Jackson was right that part of what it was about is not indicting the entire German population, even though many of them were guilty. And many Nazis were not tried. I have a friend in London who's just been in a documentary called Getting Away with Murder, and the Nazi soldier who killed his grandmother lived to a ripe old age, and this was so what happens, what about that? uh, International justice is arbitrary. um, I think it's hard for me to say, it's revenge or retribution, although I know that part of that is true. I would rather think it is a reestablishment of the rules. Let me give you an example that's smaller, but it makes me understand things better. So I was in the courtroom when the Syrian colonel was convicted of war crimes. And there were some witnesses who were very thoughtful about the process. They had been tortured by this guy, and they were in the courtroom when the verdict was given. And, I talked to them, and they said, you know what we're the happiest about? That he he was tried in a real court of law under real law, and we weren't. And as bad as it was for me, I'm happy about that. That gives me satisfaction. And I thought, okay, I don't know. I've not been tortured. It's hard for me to. I don't know. Is that really that's what makes you happy? Okay. Then a few weeks later, there was a trial in Virginia, and it was with the Foley family. And remember, the Americans extradited one of the quote Beatles who had beheaded their son. And when the trial was over, the father said, what really made what I was satisfied about is he was tried in a real court of law. That's not what he did with my son. He was the judge and the jury, and he beheaded him, but we didn't do that. And there's something about that. There's something about this idea that we are law-abiding humans and you aren't. And we must bring back the rule of law, because that's how the world's supposed to work. It has to be logical. There has to be reason. It's what Jackson said about power. Power has to answer to reason. And so, in my best days, I think that's what this is about. I think, of course, there's an element of retribution. Of course, there is. Ask Germany after the First World War. So, I'm for the rule of law, I think, is where I would come down on that.
Continuing with that question about impunity and why there might be a sense of this ability to continue to increase it. As you pointed out yourself, there are geopolitical reasons that we don't hold countries responsible.
Correct.
Like what you're talking about, Russia. It was convenient for us in their actions in Syria. Same thing with like Khashoggi, that were willing to let Saudi Arabia get away with something like that. How much is that playing in so that what happens in a criminal court is sort of beside the point?
True. There are double standards, and everybody knows it. And it's interesting that as soon as, the Lindsey Graham bill came, all the human rights community said, really? Just for Ukraine? How interesting. You guys only want to have international justice when it suits your aims. You didn't do it over Khashoggi. You don't do it over Israel-Palestine. There's plenty of places. You never let anybody question your invasion of Iraq. There were plenty of people who said that was illegal, but how about Abu Ghraib? Anybody question on that one? So yeah, are there double standards? You bet. But does that then stop us from asking for accountability this time? And because we haven't had any. Our last reasonable tribunal was the Yugoslavian one. It was imperfect, but there were some people who felt they got some justice. And then we created the ICC as the permanent one and kind of crippled it a bit. So it's been doing African cases. It's been useless. and perhaps it will redeem its reputation now. That would be great. Um, but there has to be a part where you say, you know what? Okay, we were terrible. So let's move on and let's try to get accountability somewhere. At least let's get one on the books, and then we see. I mean, the alternative is and I have friends who do this, who just say, the Americans, it's just like them. It's always double standards. Why are we even bothering with this? Because it's meaningless. And I just can't go there, to tell you the truth. I think there needs to be a demonstration project, and now is as good a time as any.
We've got one last time for one last question, so I'll end with the question that was texted to me. Any good book recommendations on the prosecution of war crimes? Light reading before bed, perhaps.
That's the end of that question?
No, that was me. I'm sorry.
No, there isn't.
Wow, succinct answer. Let's thank Deb Amos for being with us today.
Yeah, it's a safe answer.
Wow, so much for us to think about, right? So I hope you keep talking about this together in your groups, and join us here 1 week from tonight, where we will have Mary Gallagher from the University of Michigan talking about what's next in U.S.-China relations. That's interesting. I kind of want to ask her about balloons, I think. But we'll ask her about a lot of things, and she'll bring some great wisdom to that interesting conversation in the world, too. Thank you for being here. Have a good night.